Despite all of the enemies that can usually be found in them, video game levels will usually feature environments that are maybe not always pleasant, but at least aren't all that upsetting. Working one's way meticulously through one of these areas might culminate in some sort of boss battle against a giant monster, which is done more often than not by wailing on them from the outside, which is the preferable side of the foe to be on. I think we can all agree. Sometimes though, games will take things a step further and make players fight through monsters from the inside instead. It certainly makes for a change of pace, but I hope you weren't wearing your good shoes, because they won't ever be the same afterwards. Today then, we've gathered a few such disgusting examples from games that will see players clambering around in guts and grime in order to bring them closer to achieving their ultimate goal. At least I certainly hope so, because I'm not wading around in this bile for nothing, let me tell you that. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 gross video game levels set inside creatures' bodies. Number 10. Dexter's Island 2, Ape Escape. Sometimes the creatures that players find themselves traversing through are the main enemy, but that isn't always the case. Take this lovely dinosaur from Ape Escape, for example, who seems to be perfectly content going about his day before we get involved. In order to get inside the dino, codenamed Dexter, the player just has to hit him with one of Spike's many weapons and hop into his mouth when he opens it in protest. Seems a bit rude if you ask me, but I guess you have to get those escaped apes somehow, right? It seems the dino is used to having strange things in his insides though, and not just because of all the simians, but because one of the first things the player is greeted with is a bit of an old ship. By platforming around it and all the various layers of guts, as well as swimming through various bodily fluids, Spike is finally able to track down all of the apes in the level. It's unclear whether the massive lizard swallowed the apes up intentionally or not, but either way, I'm sure he's grateful that the menaces are no longer climbing around his intestines and ribcage. I've had food disagree with me before, but at least it's never been literally running around in my colon. Number 9. Jormungandr, God of War. Kratos and Atreus have a massive adventure to undertake in the 2018 God of War, and as is usual for Kratos, said adventure takes them to some unusual places. For example, eventually they want to make their way into Jotunheim, but wouldn't you know it, they can't get there without diving into Jormungandr's stomach and retrieving Mimir's second eye. The massive world serpent is surprisingly unfazed by this turn of events, having a quick chat with Mimir before opening wide and waiting patiently in the water until Kratos and Boy make their way into his mouth. I'd say this makes for a particularly eventful day, but this is Kratos we're talking about here. He's definitely seen the innards of plenty of creatures before, so this is no more a chore for him than going down to the local shop. What follows is an admittedly short trip down the giant snake's gullet to a set of surprisingly robust platforms before Kratos can get his hands on the eye. Then, shortly after, the group is unceremoniously spit back up into the icy landscape as Jormungandr collapses. Maybe they should have cleared out some of the rubble while they were in there. Oh well, I suppose it's too late now. Number 8. Mayavora, Chia. With its pleasant colour palette and lush green island setting, Chia doesn't seem like a game that would get especially gory. However, things take a drastic turn once the heroine meets Mayavora towards the end of the story. When Chia finally goes to confront the big bad, he just chuckles and decides to swallow her in one distressingly large gulp after she seemingly gives herself up. Unfortunately for him though, this doesn't get rid of her quite as effectively as he would have liked, and Chia finds herself inside of his stomach, along with all of the other missing children he's devoured over the years. While there, she's able to follow 2 separate paths, each of which will present her with a specific challenge and task Chia with destroying the large all-seeing eye that happens to be in each room. Once this is done, she's able to throw a magical bomb into Mayavora's now exposed heart, causing him to spew up all the kids inside and turn back into a tiny wiggly grub once again. Thankfully, none of them seem too worse for wear, apart from being a bit goopy, so life on the island should be back to normal soon enough. Number 7. Water Dragon, Okami. Sometime into the watercolor adventure of Okami, the wolf goddess Amaterasu and her buddy Isun will come across the Dragon Palace, and after chatting with the Princess Otohime for a bit, she'll mention the Dragon Orb, which could help dispel a barrier if only it weren't trapped inside the water dragon's gut. By taking the shell amulet that the princess gives them, the pair can make their way to the dragon, who is lounging in a hole, its mouth pointed directly up and obligingly open, perfect for anyone hoping to jump in. Thankfully, compared to what we've seen so far, the inside of the dragon is a much more pleasant experience in general, looking more like a garden for most of the time, as opposed to a stomach and intestines. There are still demons to fight along the way, but it can never all be sunshine and rainbows, can it? After some fighting and riding water spouts, the player will come across the orb suspended by tendons, which are impervious until they head down a side passage and flood the area with a suspicious red liquid. Yeah, what was I saying about this being a bit nicer than the previous entries? I'm not so sure anymore. Maybe it's just best to move on. Number 6. Insidious, Bayonetta 2. There are a great many monsters in the Bayonetta series that would be big enough to swallow the witch whole several times over. One of these is the massive Insidious, but the initial encounter takes place entirely on the outside, as most tend to do. You would think, after this long fight, that the creature would have had enough, but apparently not, as just when it seems to be finished, the thing swings back around and swallows Bayonetta. Unfortunately for the monster though, this does not take care of the witch, and in fact only makes it easier for her to once again beat the absolute stuffing out of it, only this time from the inside. As she goes, Bayonetta can attack the various pustules she finds in order to collect resources, and she'll also have to deal with other monsters that have taken up residence inside the massive creature previously. But of course, Bayonetta always has to one-up itself in terms of spectacle, so it doesn't end with a few little skirmishes and punching some internal organs. No, as the encounter draws to a close, the player will get into a massive fight with the masked Lumen, which causes loads of internal bleeding and eventually culminates in a giant monster fight on the inside of another giant monster. Talk about killing two birds with one stone. Number 5. Stella Santiago, Space Quest 6. For the most part, when game protagonists go inside of some creature, it is just that, a creature. In the case of Space Quest 6 though, we're venturing into a human, or at least a humanoid, for the very first time. Towards the end of his long, parody-riddled adventure, protagonist Roger Wilco will have to be shrunk down and injected into the body of his love interest, Stella Santiago, so that he can get rid of all the nanites that have taken over. In order to take care of them and make his way through the stomach, esophagus, and other parts of the body, Roger will have to use point-and-click logic and an assortment of absolutely bizarre items he finds along his way to create grappling hooks and puzzle solutions. This will eventually allow him to do perfectly normal things such as drown nanites in stomach acid or ride a tapeworm, all in the name of protecting Stella's body from hostile takeover by eventually taking care of the robots in her brain. She might feel a little funny when she wakes up, but hey, at least her mind and body are all her own. Hopefully she isn't too curious about what exactly her surgery entailed though, because those sorts of images are enough to end even the strongest of relationships. Number 4. Leviathan, Devil May Cry 3. The Devil May Cry series, much like Bayonetta, is known for its massive spectacle and over-the-top combat, so perhaps it's no surprise that it too has had its iconic protagonist become Monster Chow at one point. Specifically, in Devil May Cry 3, after a particularly dramatic exit from a battle with Virgil, Dante is falling through the sky when all of a sudden a giant flying whale drops in out of nowhere and rudely comes right over to scoop him up in its enormous maw. This massive out-of-place monster is the Leviathan, and much like the rest of the creatures on this list, its plan doesn't really go the way it had hoped, because Dante is surprisingly unharmed and undigested, living to fight another day, namely by beating up the Leviathan's insides. What follows is quite an unpleasant slog through both groups of demons and pools of acid as Dante makes his way through the bowels of the creature, trying to hunt down the polyps that will open new pathways and hopefully lead him closer to escape. Eventually, all this effort pays off, and he's finally able to make his way through the pulsating guts of the Leviathan and destroy its 3 hearts before making his dramatic exit out of the creature's eye. Lovely. Number 3. Jabu-Jabu's Belly, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. For the most part, Zelda games have a pretty standard pattern when it comes to their dungeons. There's the forest area, the fire area, the water area, and so on. One notable exception, though, is in Ocarina of Time. That's because, instead of being a boring old temple, this area requires players to guide Link through the insides of the Zora's guardian, Lord Jabu-Jabu, in an effort to rescue the missing Princess Ruto. In order to get into the creature, though, Link will first have to make sure that he has a fish offering for the beast, who will then hopefully inhale the green-clad hero. It seems it's a good thing as well, because the poor beast is full of nasty jellyfish and all kinds of parasites, a result of Ganondorf's curse and the main reason Jabu-Jabu has become both quite ill and ill-tempered recently, and presumably why he ate the princess in the first place. Along the way, Link finds Princess Ruto, who thankfully seems no worse for wear, considering, and has to carry her along with him to make sure she gets out safely. Once the boss parasite is taken care of, though, everything is back to normal, including Jabu-Jabu himself. At least for the time being, that is. Number 2. Monstro, Kingdom Hearts. Given that part of its whole appeal is the inclusion of Disney-themed worlds, it perhaps comes as no surprise that one of the places Sora and friends can visit in Kingdom Hearts is an area based on the classic cartoon Pinocchio. It is a bit surprising, though, that when players reach the end of the gummy ship section to this particular world, they are suddenly greeted by the whale Monstro, who gulps them up in no time flat. Here the crew will meet Geppetto and Pinocchio, who have also gotten themselves and their boat gobbled up. The former seems to be having a bit of trouble keeping tabs on his puppet's son, however, as during their conversation, the boy wanders off further into the whale. Why would anyone do that voluntarily? This prompts Sora, Goofy, and Donald to explore further themselves, making their way through the confusing maze-like innards of the creature and battling hordes of Heartless as they try to track down Pinocchio. And wouldn't you know it, he's only gonna manage to get himself trapped by a boss. Thankfully, this is no trouble for the trio, and they are able to take care of the foe before Monstro sneezes them and their ship back out again, ready to continue on their adventure. Though maybe after they take a quick trip to the gummy car wash. And number 1, Intestinal Distress, Earthworm Jim. We've been through quite a lot with this list, quite literally, but we're not at the end just yet. There's still one more chunk of viscera left for us to wade through, and this time it comes to us courtesy of Earthworm Jim. One of the late levels of the game, aptly known as Intestinal Distress, will see Jim fighting and platforming his way through the inside of some horrible, unknown creature. Along the way, he'll be dodging unsettling orbs and strange bouncing organ-like objects, complete with horrible squishing noises that really add to the atmosphere in an impressive but terrible way. Even the final boss of the area, though quite small, is disturbingly biological, taking the form of some kind of sentient stomach or the like, with nasty squelchy noises and acidic attacks to boot. The only mercy here is that the level overall is much shorter than a lot of the others, so at least it isn't too gross for too long. Thankfully though, with that, our distress is over, as there are no more massive animals lying in wait to make hapless folks their dinner. What do you mean there's a gigantic monster looming right behind me, ready to swallow me up for its dinner? I don't understand what you're talking about. I'm sure it's fine.